Alright, today we're going to talk about properties of numbers. What is an inverse? So, an inverse is kind of like the undo button on your computer, okay? Edit, undo. It's kind of like if you're adding, if I add 2, the opposite would be to subtract that 2 to get back to what you started at, okay? So an additive inverse is like the opposite operation. So if you were, let me just write that now so you can write it down, opposite, okay? So then if we were going to do something where it says find the additive inverse of 3, if we are going to add 3, okay, the inverse to get it back to what you started with is minus 3, okay? So the additive inverse would be minus 3. The additive inverse of negative 1/2, as I subtract 1/2 to get back to what I started with, I would have to add 1/2. Okay, so the additive inverse is just the opposite. Now, the additive identity, what do you get back to? Well, if I add 3 and then subtract 3, I am back at 0. That is the additive identity. Now, it's the additive identity because anything plus 0 doesn't change. Okay, anything plus 0 doesn't change. You get what you started with. It's the identity. Alright, so there are your notes for additive stuff. Now let's go on to the next page. Down to multiplicative inverse. Okay. Alright, the multiplicative inverse. What is the opposite of multiplying? That is dividing. Okay, so the multiplicative inverse is called the reciprocal. Okay, the reciprocal, because if we have something like 2, that would be 2 over 1. The reciprocal would be 1 over 2. It's like dividing. Okay, 2 and then 1 divided by 2. So putting it into a reciprocal is kind of like dividing. So when you find the multiplicative inverse of 3, the inverse of 3, you're looking for the reciprocal, would be 3 over 1. The inverse would be 1/3. The multiplicative inverse of negative 1/2. So if you start with negative 1/2, the reciprocal, as you flip it around, it becomes 2 over 1. Was negative, stays negative. Okay? Now the multiplicative identity. What can you multiply any number by and still get the same number? What can you multiply any number by and still get the same number? 1. 1 is the multiplicative identity. Anything times 1 doesn't change. Okay? Now, lastly here, the multiplicative property of 0. If you multiply anything by 0, you get 0. So it's like saying anything times 0 equals 0. That is the multiplicative property of 0. Okay, the next page is a couple examples. So I'm going to stop here and we'll do those on the next video.